reflect back when we started. When we started the first session, I was actually broadcasting to you from Abu Dhabi, and I know a lot of you didn't show for the first session, but like first session was in Abu Dhabi. Second session, I had to give you a heads up that there is a good chance I would have to run to a bomb shelter. And today, as we're approaching the last session, for the first time after 12 years, Israel is seeing a change in government. Now, regardless of how I personally feel for or against of this change of government, I think it's an historical moment for the state of Israel that our democracy is strong and we're able to change leaders, even if not everyone in the country are in full agreement with those changes. And therefore, we've had 3 historical moments in 4 sessions, because for me, I regard me talking to you as an Israeli citizen from Abu Dhabi, from the United Arab Emirates in the first session, is without a doubt a historical moment. And I'll say something even more, that probably never happened in history. An Israeli guy sitting in the United Arab Emirates giving a virtual tour of Israel, that's something that never happened before. Tina is asking, who is the prime minister now? So I don't know if now, maybe it will happen during our session, because the new government right now is in the process of being sworn in the Knesset in Jerusalem. By the time we're done, our new prime minister, get used to the title, is going to be Naftali Bennett. A fun fact, he and Benjamin Netanyahu served in the same unit in the IDF, of course, in 30 years apart in terms of age, but they both served in Sayeret Matkal, which is the Israeli Delta Force, which perhaps shines the light on the importance of military service in this country. On the other hand, in 2 years, we're going to have a rotation with our prime minister, which is a new creation of the last couple of years. And we're going to have a prime minister who is actually a journalist, a writer. Some would say he was the most popular Israeli writer in history. They call him he's someone who knew how to identify the Israeli DNA in his writing, social DNA. His name is Yair Lapid. In 2 years, they're going to rotate if the government will survive. So again, a very, very special morning. I want to say thank all of you for being here. And because I know we're always stressed for time, so we're going to start. Mazal Tov, thank you for your greetings. 1 sec. Can you make me a co-host just so I can share my screen? So as this is, I think,
yeah. Tama, who has to do that?
Yeah. No, here we're done. We're good.
I did.
All right. Okay, good. Okay, thank you.
So 1 sec. Sorry. In the meantime, as I was trying to log on, something here went a little here. Okay, perfect. So let's get this started. All right. So today we're entering our last Jerusalem tour, and we're going to be touring Mount Zion. Right now, Mount Zion, for me, is one of my favorite places to tour. And I'll start off by saying a few things about Mount Zion as a site. If you are coming to Israel on a church trip, if you're not Catholic, there is a very good chance you will not cover Mount Zion in your tour. If you're coming to Israel with your synagogue, there is a good chance you're not going to Mount Zion as part of your tour. Why is that? Because if you belong to evangelical church of any type, Baptist, Presbyterian, any evangelical denomination, you're constantly in the search for category A sites. Do we all remember what are category A sites? Sites that archaeology meets the biblical narrative. This is what you're coming to Israel for. Mount Zion doesn't have any of that. If you're coming on a Jewish trip, and you're on the search for Jewish history, and you're going to come to Mount Zion, good chance you won't include it in your trip. Why? Because in terms of like real valuable Jewish history, there isn't that much. So if we only have 4 sessions together, you're probably wondering, why did I include Mount Zion in our itinerary if you want to go visit it on a church or a synagogue trip? Because to me, Mount Zion helps us understand how people create narratives in the land of Israel. Every religion in a certain period of history has shaped the narrative and the story of this land. In the history we can learn from Mount Zion that facts in archaeology are not always part of the story we're telling. And today we're going to look at it from a Christian lens. We're going to look at it from a Jewish lens, from a Muslim lens. All religions are guilty of creating a narrative, in some cases, when we don't have much archaeology to back this up. So if you're already a little confused and you're not sure where this tour is going to take you, great. That's the position I like you most at, when you're a little uncomfortable, a little unsure what we're going to cover. So let's get started. Mount Zion is outside the walls of the old city. How can you tell in an aerial photo where the old city of Jerusalem is? Very simple. It's the most densely populated area. You can see it as this white cluster over here of buildings. Mount Zion, as you can see it with the red pin, is just outside the old city, a bit south. All right, let's do a little bit of a aerial photo to see how many traditions we're going to meet in our tour. Let's start from the floor. Below us, most Christian denominations would believe this is the site, the room of the Last Supper, where Jesus and his disciples sat down on their last Seder dinner before Jesus was captured in where we visited last week, Gethsemane. But this building has 2 floors. So what's down below it? Down below it, we have the site of the burial site of King David. And therefore, it's a very important site to Jews and Christians alike. Now, after you're already confused with those 2 facts, over here, you're going to see a minaret, which means there was a historical time period that this site, the room of the Last Supper, the tomb of King David, has served as an active mosque. Now I'm going to even confuse you even more. Do you see this, let's be honest, kind of ugly dome over here? What if I told you that for 20 years, this served as the study, as the private office of the president of Israel? Remind you that in Israel, we have a president. It's a symbolic figure. He's our official head of state, but like the Queen of England, doesn't have much political power. For 19 years, this was his study over here. And all the historical traditions I told you don't have any physical backing, right? But it doesn't stop people from coming and worshiping and remembering those events right here. We'll touch more on that as we're touring by. A little bit of an aerial photo just to orientate ourselves a little better. So first of all, this mountaintop that you see here with the church tower, this is where we started our tour last week. This is the Mount of Olives. And if you take a look north, this over here is a modern day church around 120 years called the Dormition Church. But behind it, you can already peek behind those trees into the old city. In a way, this church kind of blocks the view of the old city of Jerusalem, because Mount Zion, if you remember from this aerial photo, is right outside of the old city. Now, I talked for a bunch about Mount Zion, Mount Zion, Mount Zion, Mount Zion. What is Zion? Zion is Jerusalem. So I know Zionism today has become a very political word, but literally when you say I'm a Zionist, the literal meaning is I am a Jerusalemist. What does that mean politically? I leave it for you, but this is what the word Zion means. Zion is mentioned in the first time in the Bible, in the 2nd book of Kings. I believe it is in chapter 5, and it's referencing to Jerusalem, to the city that King David will conquer. Now, the next question we need to ask ourselves is, well, 2,000 years ago, which is the period we're discussing in great length. We discussed it last week. What did Jews call the period of 2,000 years ago? Do you remember? The era of the Second Temple. What do Christians refer to this time? They could refer to it as the era of the Second Temple. Most likely Christians would use the ministry of Jesus, the time that Jesus walked in this earth. So what was going on? One sec, I froze. Am I back? Can you all see me? Yes, all right. Sorry about that. So let's just go here and reload the image that is frozen. But what I want to ask you is this. So at the time of Jesus, what was going on here exactly at Mount Zion? And did they even refer to it as Mount Zion? In order to do this, one sec, let's share the screen. Here we go. So you can see that at the time of Jesus, this area, sorry. All right, here, back. So at the time of Jesus, this area was referred to as the upper city, which means that this is where the elite of the community live in. Some call it the priestly courtyard. I want to show you what this looked like in a 3D, because a 3D would give us a far better understanding. All right, so you're now looking at the upper city. Without a doubt, when you're looking at this aerial photo, you can see that the houses we find here are very, very well-off homes. Now, let's try and get into the mindset of Jesus, all right? What do we know about Jesus? He is a Jew, right? He's coming from Nazareth, which means he's not a very wealthy character. In his teachings, in what he does in his ministry, he's helping the poor and the needy. If we quote from the Sermon of the Mount, where he puts down the pillars of his movement, they don't call it a religion. It's a movement, perhaps a restoration movement that exists within Judaism. What does he say? The last shall be first. So when I'm trying to think, where would Jesus have his Last Supper? I don't think he's hanging in this courtyard. Right? That's not where he would have sit down with his disciples. Where do I think the Last Supper would most likely happen? You see over here the lower city with the smaller homes where the lower working class people live in. This is where I think the Last Supper would have taken place in, which in many ways diminishes the claim that the Last Supper would have been over here on Mount Zion. How did this tradition, how was it created? We'll talk about it later. But I want to take you even one step further. When you came to Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, and you would say, hey guys, see you later, I'm going to Zion. What did you mean? Do you mean the upper city where we just looked at, or do we mean a completely different place? So the word Zion actually throughout history has shifted from one geographical place to another. And this perhaps is the most interesting piece of this lecture, if you ask me. 3,000 years ago, when people said Zion, they were referring to the city of David, the historical nucleus of Jerusalem, a very, very small city. At the time of Jesus, so the era of the Second Temple, when people said Zion, they exclusively meant the temple complex itself. What am I trying to say here? That when Jesus said to his disciples, if he said it, hey, I'm going to Zion, he did not intend where we started our tour. He intended the temple itself. So the question that we need to ask ourselves is, how did Mount Zion, the name Zion, has shifted from the city of David to the temple we already understand, but to this hill called the Upper Hill, where we were looking at just a second ago? How did this name move? So in order to do this, we need to remind ourselves of something we discussed in our previous tour. You all remember the destruction of the temple? If you're a Christian, you would say Jesus prophesied it. If you're Jewish, you say this happened due to baseless hate, to the divisions that existed in the Jewish world, but there's no question about the end result. Jerusalem, with its temple in the year 70, is going to be burnt down to the ground. What is the dominant religion that exists in the Roman world after the temple burns down? People will often tell me, well, Christianity, isn't it? And I tell them no, because when the temple burnt down, most of the Christians were still active Jews. And as a result of the temple, then Christianity would separate away from Judaism. So it's not Judaism versus Christianity. It's Judaism versus the Roman world when Christianity was beginning its journey as an independent religion. Now, in the Roman world, even after the destruction of the temple, all right, remember this, even with the destruction, Judaism had a legal status. It was accepted in the Roman world to be Jewish. Judaism never posed a threat on the Roman world. You know why Judaism never posed a threat? Because Judaism was surrounded by very high walls. I call these walls the walls of halakha, Jewish law, right? Like, people were intrigued with the idea of believing in one God. But when they realized that this comes as a package deal with being circumcised in an older age, they're like, thank you, but no thank you. Christianity as it's being created by Paul, gives you this huge advantage of monotheism without observing Jewish law, right? Think of our first tour in Jaffa. And therefore, Christianity poses a far greater threat on the Roman world. The Romans are deeply concerned what would happen if the masses convert to this new religion. Why? Because in Rome, there is no separation of religion and state. The two are inseparable. If people will become Christian, are they really loyal to Rome? There's also a financial component. There's always a financial component, right? Financial component is 20% of the income of the Roman world came from worshiping in Roman pagan temples. If everyone were going to become Christian, who would come to those temples? And therefore, Christianity was heavily, heavily persecuted. How's this related to Mount Zion? I promise you 2 more minutes and everything will be clear. The Romans heavily persecute Christianity until a new emperor comes along in the 4th century. So Christianity was forbidden for over 250 years. The name of this emperor is Constantine the Great. He is the one, together with his mother, Helena, that makes Christianity not only a legal religion, but the Roman state religion. And this creates a huge shift in the role of Jerusalem in the Roman world. From being a defeated city, defeated by the Romans in the year 70, all of a sudden Jerusalem is being put on a pedestal. This is where Jesus Christ was crucified, buried, and resurrected. Of course, the city needs to be glorified. Once Christianity is the legal religion, the Romans start to pour masses of money to Jerusalem to build churches. Take a look at this map over here. This map over here shows us a representation of Jerusalem somewhere in the 6th century. This map is a geographical map partly, but this map is also built to create a narrative. What do I mean? Take a look at the churches you see here. Over here, you see the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Over here on the right, you see the Nia Church. Over here, you see another church. This is a church today found in Mount Zion. You see all of those massive, massive churches. So far, you with me? You see the massive churches in this map from the 6th century. Now, there is a key place that this map is missing. I'm going to show you where that is. One sec. I keep seeing people joining the Zoom, which is a great pleasure. All right. You see here the temple complex on the right? You're like, yeah, Saf, but the temple was destroyed in the year 70. We're here like 500 years after, and I tell you, you're absolutely right. But this massive square, the size of 14 American football fields, this is still there. Do you see anything that represents this massive empty space in this map from the 6th century? And the answer is, well, you don't. Do you want to know where the Temple Mount complex is on this map? All right, take your breath. You see this, where my mouse is? This is the size of the map they chose to allocate to the Temple Mount complex. Obviously, this map is not geographical. It's telling you a narrative. What is the narrative? Christianity is now the dominant religion. And therefore, the house of the Lord is going to be minimized because it's no longer relevant. This represents the Old Testament of the Jews. Jerusalem is now a Christian city, and we're going to minimize the size of the Temple Mount. And now you're going to get what I mean by the name Mount Zion. When Jerusalem is under Christian denomination, there is an active attempt to erase the Jewish heritage of Jerusalem. And when I say Christian, please don't be offended. I'm not blaming anyone here. Talking about historical and political events that happened 1400 years ago. Please don't be offended by my statements here, okay? I'm just trying to give you the historical feel of things. They took the name Zion that was related to the Temple Mount and moved it to a new mountain in Jerusalem. So Zion was moved from the temple to what we call the upper hill to serve a religious political narrative, a new covenant. This is why the name shifted. Now, the problem was, and I think it's very obvious to everyone, that there is no Christian history in this area. Why? Because this area, if anything, this is where the priests live, not people who are glorified in the Gospels. We can all agree on that. and therefore you need to add and create traditions. We don't know what tradition the church on Mount Zion, the Hagia Zion Church, was dedicated to. Most likely it was to do with Mary, perhaps an early tradition of the site of the burial of Mary, the mother of Christ. But as we know, Christians are not going to be, and again, the Roman Empire, say Christians, I don't mean Christians, the Roman Empire is not going to be in power here forever. In the 7th century, the Muslim power actually comes and conquers the city, and surprisingly, leaves the churches untouched until one Muslim leader comes along. And his name is Al-Hakim Bamr Allah. And the year is 1049. And he decides to break this long chain of religious tolerance and burn down all the churches in the Holy Land, including the church on Mount Zion, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's very important to get the full frame here. All Muslim leaders up until that one were tolerant except this one. Now, this creates the seed of the Crusaders who will try and rescue the Holy Land from who they call the infidels, because they're burning churches. And when the Crusaders come here, they arrive at Mount Zion and they add another layer to the story. Of course, because there was a church there, the Hagia Zion Church, was dedicated to Mary, they decide to build here another church. And this church comes in with a new tradition. They build a church here, and I'm sorry it's loading, but here we go. They build a church, and they say this church is the room of the Last Supper. Now you're like, based on what? Not based on anything. But there was a need to put the foot in the door and create a Christian outhold in this specific geographical area, so they build this church. Now, because this is the room of the Last Supper, and this, bear here with me because it's important. This is the church, this is the room of the Last Supper, supposedly, okay? Now, based on that tradition, there's another tradition saying that the Pentecost that happens 49 days, the Pentecost where the tongues of flame come to the disciples and they start speaking different languages, happens in the same place, all right? So this is the second tradition. Not only the room of Last Supper, but the site of the Pentecost. And based on this claim, we're arriving to the King David piece, all right? What's the King David piece? If you read in the book of Acts, it says here, fellow Israelites, I can tell you confidently that the patriarch David died and was buried, and his tomb is here with us to this day. This is what Peter says at the event of the Pentecost. Now, if you ask me, Peter means this, and I think anyone who knows the Gospels, the scriptures, would say he means it metaphorically. It doesn't physically mean that King David is present with them at the Pentecost. It means that in his spirit, he is there with them. But the Crusaders say, if this is the Last Supper, and if this is the site of the Pentecost, then this is also going to be the burial site, the tomb of King David. So far, I'm pausing, and I want to ask if there are any questions, because we've covered a lot of grounds, and I really want to make sure that we're all straight on this. Questions so far?
Yeah, hi.
Hey.
This is Mike. When was the time then of the Jewish martyrology, Bar Kokhba and Akiba, if the Jews were protected by the Romans? When did that happen?
I skipped this piece just because the sake of time. So the destruction of the temple took place in the year 70. The Bar Kokhba revolt happened in the year 132. But the important thing to understand is that the Bar Kokhba revolt, to the best of our knowledge today, did not have an impact in Jerusalem. The reason being, Jerusalem was already destroyed in the year 70 and was not yet rebuilt at the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt. That's why I took the intellectual liberty to skip this event, not because just sake of time. Does this make sense? All right. Any other questions so far? Please don't be shy, friends. I urge you, ask anything. All right, don't be hesitant if you're like, wait, but is my question going to make me silly? I've been silly enough times in my life. It's not the end of the world. All right. So now we're getting to the real interesting piece. You are now in a room which is no older than 1,000 2,000 years. And therefore, we can agree that the probability of this being the room of the Last Supper is very, very slim, because the Last Supper took place 2,000 years ago. But we're going to find here several interesting artifacts. If this was built as a church, please tell me, why do we have here Arabic engraving on the wall speaking about the greatness of King David? And the decoration here is definitely Muslim. And over here, if you look, do you see this? This is a mihrab facing towards Mecca. Then you might get the impression, well, am I trying to cheat you here? On the other hand, when we look at the architecture, is without a doubt Crusader. Look at these pointy arches. Those pointy arches and those pillars and their shape are definitely Crusaders. Now you're like, well, so is it a mosque or is it a church? Now I'm going to confuse you even more. You see over here in the pillar? In the pillar, you see, it's hard to see, so I've zoomed in for you. This is this pillar that we're looking at. What you're looking at here is a pelican. Pelican in Christian art is always a representation of Jesus. Reason being that in the era before biology was fully understood, it is viewed that the pelican is feeding its young from its own meat. Now, when you think about it, it's a very symbolic artistic representation, because what does Jesus say in the Last Supper? Drink, this is my blood, the new covenant, eat, this is my meat. So obviously we would find this here. Now, if this serves as a mosque, there's no way that it would be untouched over here, because the Muslims are against anything that is a representation of any animal or human, right? So what's the deal over here? The deal is this. This was used as a church until the Muslims inherited this space in the 15th century. And when we think, do you remember our first tour in Jaffa? We said that a lot of Jewish and Christian heroes find their way into the Quran, most likely because Muhammad learned how to read and write, most likely from Jews or Christians who were the only literate population in the Arab Peninsula. That's how we find Jewish and Christian traditions in Islam. David is a holy figure, so is Jesus. Nebi Isa, there he's named. And therefore, the Muslims took custody of this place and turned the church into a mosque. And in the process, they have spared this piece over here that would have been destroyed, and no one is really sure why was this spared. But when you think about it, now we have a 3 claim to the site, because what we have down right below this, and one sec, it's loading now, but you're looking at the tomb of King David. Now, can we all understand that there is zero Jewish history saying that this is the tomb of King David? It's based on a Crusader tradition, but it doesn't stop Jews from praying here in a synagogue. The coffin in the synagogue that says King David is our king, this is a Crusader coffin, and most likely the person buried there is a Christian. And what do we look over here? You see this hole in the wall? It's another mihrab facing towards Mecca. Right, so how did this happen? In 1948, and this already brings me to modern. So you know what here? Let's add the map for our purpose, and then it will be a little easier to understand. All right, so what you're looking at over here is a map of Jerusalem in 1949. And when you look at this map, you understand that the old city, you see it in red, was in one side, and the West Jerusalem, the Israeli part of Jerusalem, was in the other side. Where is Mount Zion? Do you see my mouse? This is exactly where Mount Zion is. Try and think of the Zionist idea. What is Zionism? Zionism, we said in the beginning, Zionism is Jerusalemism, right? The Jewish return to their historical homeland. In 1948, the Jews have managed to establish a state. But look at the irony. The Zionist movement has created the Jewish state without a Zion. Yes, there was Jerusalem, but all of the old city was on the other side. What was the closest site to the old city in Jerusalem? Mount Zion. Now, Mount Zion all of a sudden was elevated on a pedestal by the Zionist movement, by the Israeli government. Not because it was important historically, we discussed, there's like zero Jewish history, but because this was the closest we had. So what happened as a result of it? And this is, to me at least, it's fascinating. Number one, the site over here, which served, one sec, not, all right. So over here, which served as a mosque, was automatically turned into a room of worship. Or like a room of worship, that's a weird name for a church. It's not a church. State of Israel decided to make this a site for all religions to come, pray, and worship in, but it was not handed to one single Christian denomination. Because the state of Israel says the following thing: who are we going to hand this over to? The Catholics will upset the Greek Orthodox. The Greek Orthodox will upset the Coptics. The Coptics will upset the Ethiopians, etc. So the state of Israel says this upper floor, what is known to be the room of the Last Supper, a site for all people to worship in. You can pray silently, and there are 2 days a year for every Christian denomination on the day of the Pentecost, according to their calendar, where they can come here and worship. For the rest of the year, it's open, and this is typically what it looks like on an ordinary day. Because of the King David story, State of Israel took the bottom floor, above us is the room of the Last Supper, and turned this for the first time in history into an Israeli Jewish Orthodox synagogue. Now, if you ask me, do those people know that they're praying on the coffin of a Christian that lived 1,000 years ago as they're commemorating King David? Most likely they don't. But if I told this straight to their face, they would be a little disappointed. You can see here people are fully worshiping. Now, that wasn't enough, because when you don't have your historical roots, the state of Israel, like the Roman Catholic Empire did earlier, needed to create those roots. And this next part to me is fascinating. State of Israel has decided on the top floor to build a study of the Israeli president. So the Israeli president was, one sec, everything here froze off as it was, as my computer slightly slowed down in the process. So here, it's reloading now. So what the Israeli government did is they decided to build a study of the president here, and Jews who came made aliyah. Are you familiar with the word aliyah? Aliyah in Hebrew means to ascend. It's the Jewish term we use when Jews came to the temple. It's also the term we use to describe when Jews moved to Israel. It's quite funny in Hebrew. We have one word for immigration and a whole different word for when Jews move to Israel. We call it aliyah. And the people who do it, we call them olim, pilgrims. So when Jews made aliyah to Israel in the 1950s, they were brought to this specific site, to Mount Zion. And over here, you can see, this is the study of the president. This is the photo, this is where we started. They were brought here, looked to the walls of the old city, and this is where they swore to be loyal citizens to the Jewish state, standing on Mount Zion. On Hanukkah, they had marches and parades coming over here. On the day of the Jewish calendar where King David, it's the traditional day of his death, people came here and had celebrations for him. All new pieces of history that were created just during that time frame. But that's not the end. Over here on Mount Zion, in 1949, before the creation of Yad Vashem, if you've been to Israel before, you know Yad Vashem is an inseparable part of any visit to Israel. Yad Vashem is the Israeli official Holocaust museum and memorial. State of Israel built here in 1949, the first state-built monument for the Holocaust on top of Mount Zion. It's called the Cellar of the Holocaust. It was built before Yad Vashem. And down the stairs, what we have here, we have actually ashes that were brought here from Birkenau, Bergen-Belsen, and Dachau. And you can see that in the early days of Israel, you can see that these are all Hebrew letters, but the plaque is actually written in Hebrew and in Yiddish, because in the 1950s, the dominant language amongst Jews coming from Europe was Yiddish, something that later on was kind of erased by the Israeli government as a spoken language. So what happened to Mount Zion? If it was so important, why today you don't come visit it? I mean, it's a recent attempt, right? What changed is 1967. As soon as Israel, and I'm going to be very careful with my wording, invades, frees, liberates, occupies, reunifies Jerusalem, as soon as we have access to the Western Wall, to the Temple Mount, to the places where our ancestors walked on, what happens to Mount Zion? Goes downhill. No one needs Mount Zion when you have the real thing. And the study of the president, where we started our tour, is very quickly left alone. And today it's just a locked up room, right? So I'm going to use one last example, and then I'll open it up for your questions. And I'm sure you have, hope you have some. So over here, this is the bottom part of the Dormition Church. You remember the Dormition Church? We saw it right in the beginning in our first slide. So as we did our lookout and we looked into the Dormition Church, I told you it's a modern day church. But in the cellar of this modern day church, we have the place which is known to be as the burial place of Mary. Not really burial place. What you see is an open tomb. Why an open tomb? Because according to the Catholic tradition, Mary did not sin in the original sin, which is punishable by death. Therefore, she never died. And she was raised to the heavens by her son, Jesus. And therefore, what you're going to see here is an empty tomb. Now, one second here. So this is what you're looking at over here. This is the tomb where Mary lied until she was ascended to heavens on Mount Zion on Jerusalem. But there is another Catholic tradition. And the other Catholic tradition that Mary actually fell asleep in a house in a city in Turkey called Epsos. So the same Christian denomination, two separate traditions for the same event. And in Jerusalem itself, if you look hard enough, you're going to find an Armenian church, which also claims it has the tomb where Mary had lied until she was ascended. And this is very close to Gethsemane. Point of this tour today, at least from my perspective, is to show us that when we're coming to Israel, traditions matter. Even if those traditions don't have a lot of archaeological backing, it doesn't take away from the power of those traditions. And hundreds of thousands of people from all around the world come to see those places, which makes my job as a tour guide extremely difficult. Because what do you tell those people? Like, they didn't travel halfway across the world to hear that the thing that they're looking at is not really the thing that they're looking at, unless they really want to hear it. And I always say, like, what am I? At the end of the day, I see myself as the storyteller of this land, right? And I'm here to give people the stories that they were raised on and that they came to experience. And I'm not here to spoil their stories. Therefore, I'm very careful, and I always ask, what denomination are you from? Are you interested in archaeology? Is archaeology not your thing? And without a doubt, Mount Zion is a perfect representation for that. A place where narratives are created across history by different religions, different political movements, different denominations. And to me, this is one of my favorite sites in Israel. Open for your questions, your comments. I did leave today a little bit of extra time. I know that in 9 minutes, some of us will have to go to services. So we have 9 minutes for questions, discussion, not only about this tour, but about the 3 previous sessions as well. And there have to be questions because this session I'm confused. So definitely you're confused.
Well, okay, this is Mike again. And can you go back to that short church where you say it's also an Orthodox synagogue?
Sure. So one sec here, let's get this loaded up. So just to make sure that we're all clear, all right? Right now, this is floor number 2, all right? This today is serving as a room for all religions to pray in. This is the room of the Last Supper. But right under it, exact same building, this today is a synagogue. All right, now the reality of a synagogue and a place of Christian worship right above the other only exists since 1948. Under the British rule, it still continued to serve as a mosque open to other denominations for visits. But this church style building and synagogue, this can only coexist since 1948 when the state of Israel has been created. Does this make sense? Yeah.
But the tomb of David was not supposedly discovered until after Israel took over? I don't understand.
No. So first of all, Mary, thank you for asking. You're right. You're asking a question which is very, very relevant. There was a tradition, a Christian tradition, that started 1,000 years ago. That this over here, right? Remember, because they read the relevant passage. If this is the room of the Pentecost, and Peter refers in the Pentecost to David, where he says, "Fellow Israelites, I can tell you confidently that the patriarch David died and was buried, and his tomb is here with us to this day." This 1,000 years ago has given birth to the tradition of the tomb of King David being in this spot. All right, now this was a Christian tradition that was started, and later on, the Jews took custody of the Christian tradition, even though it's a Christian site, it's a Christian building, and the Muslims, of course, also commemorated the tomb of King David at the exact same spot. So really, what matters here? The building is the same. Tradition was created, it's a Christian tradition, but Jews and Muslims in relative time periods have took custody over the building and the tradition with it.
Okay.
Does this help clarify?
Yeah, so it was a traditional thing that preceded Israel.
Oh yeah, way before even Zionism existed.
Okay.
Hey, Judah Foreman, sorry, that's the name I see there, but I see.
I wanted to ask you the significance of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which I know is divided up into all kinds of Christian sects having charge of part of it. But I thought that was where Jesus was supposedly crucified and a bunch of other things.
So you're absolutely right. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was not part of our tour today. I talked about it last week for a bit. And the Church of the Holy Sepulchre for most Christian denominations commemorates 3 events: the site of the crucifixion, the site of burial, and the site of resurrection of Christ. Most Christian denominations would say, yes, this is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but from an archaeological perspective, it's only a category B site. Why? Because the church itself was only built 300 years and more after the crucifixion. And because we did not find there a specific tomb or proof saying this is the site, it remains a very, very strong tradition. And that's roughly 10 minutes of a walk from Mount Zion, but not on Mount Zion. Does this answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Phil
Yeah.
here.
Hey, Phil.
Yeah, so I didn't know if you were going to talk about the garden tomb or not, but
I was planning on it. So I was planning on it. I'll say something short, and then maybe there will be a follow-up session at a later point. But the garden tomb was the problem with the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is this: there is no Protestant representation in the church. It's a church divided between Coptics and Catholics and Greek Orthodox and Armenians. The Protestants are not part of the church. Why? Very simple political reason. In the 16th century, where Martin Luther puts his thesis that will start the Reformation, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is already divided up. It's an ancient church back then. It's 1,300 years old. So Protestants of all denominations are left without a site to worship in. In the 19th century, I believe the year is 1865, I think, a British general, his name is Charles Gordon, walks outside the walls of Jerusalem and sees a site that he says, this is the spot. Why? Because he sees a geographical support for it. Later on, they do an archaeological dig, and they discover Jewish tombs. What is the problem? That today, with modern archaeology, and the people at the Garden Tomb will testify that as well, we know that the tombs there predate the time of Jesus by 800 years, which means if you're trying to find a place that keeps the feel of a garden and is not a massive church with thousands of pilgrims, go to the Garden Tomb. It's a very symbolic place to connect to the events. But if you're looking for a site which I think has more of an archaeological tangibility, I would lean more to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre.
I think my question is a meta one, if it's possible. So I see your dilemma as a storyteller and as a tour guide, which is really difficult. Are you at a meta level saying choose your narratives carefully and history may overtake you and reality has really no place on Israeli tours or in Israeli history?
I use the following story. I tell people that I guide that I believe they should have two separate cabinets. One of them is archaeology and one of them is biblical narrative. And the two can coexist and they don't have to step over the other. And we have to come to the realization that sometimes we won't be able to take two cabinets and combine them into one because it simply won't fit. And maybe in a later time, we'll have archaeological discoveries that will allow that, and maybe they won't. And when I guide Christians, I tell them a Jewish story about Rabbi Fruman, who was fascinated with archaeology and was very close to a site called the tomb of Rachel, our matriarch. And he prayed there a lot. And he had a very good archaeologist friend. His name is Ehud Netzer, which sadly passed away in an archaeological excavation. But one day Ehud Netzer came to Rabbi Fruman and he said, Rabbi, I found the archaeological proof that Rachel's tomb can't be Rachel's tomb because the ceramics don't date to the time frame. And Rabbi Fruman looked at him and he said, I'm so happy for you. And how about you continue doing your job and I'll continue doing mine. So to me, it's like, it's a beautiful story how we don't always have to force the same narratives into one frame. And we can look at both frames as two separate pictures that sometimes we'll be able to mix and sometimes they won't.
Jim has a question. We just have to unmute you, Jim.
So at the last session, you, at the end, you had mentioned tour evaluations, that you'd like to get tour evaluations. I was not able to get in for the first 10 minutes of this session. In case you have not discussed that, do you want to say it once again and tell people how to do where to find the evaluations? Is that important or not?
It's important to me. So it's not an evaluation in the formal manner. TripAdvisor it's the largest travel website in the world. And I have a listing there. This is where people contact me to find me for virtual tours or for person-to-person tours, which, as you can probably tell, I prefer more because they really allow me to meet and interact with people. So over there, if you've enjoyed the session and you would want to leave a review, I put the link on the chat. It would really mean a great deal to me because this is how I'll be able to continue doing what I do and meet new people and continue telling the story of Israel. So thank you for asking about this, Jim.
So be specific. What do we need to do? Do we go to TripAdvisor website?
So I put the link in the chat. So if you look in the chat now, you can just click it and maybe we can also just have the link forwarded to your email at the end, and then you can just do it from there so you don't have to go and look in the chat right now. But really, thank you for being willing to consider even this. I have here a question from the chat. How Israelis feel about Mount Zion? Do they see that a plate of interfaith historical site for the country, not religious? I think most Israelis, sadly, don't fully know the narrative of Mount Zion. And I always tell people that I guide, you will probably know more about Mount Zion than the average Israeli. And why is that? Very simple, for what I told you before. Once Israel gained control, captured, reunited, liberated, conquered Jerusalem, the old city, Mount Zion has become almost irrelevant. And when people do come to tour Mount Zion, Israelis, they come to see this building that was once a mosque and today is a church and a synagogue at the same time. So if people do come, they see it like as a cool anecdote, like, oh, look how everyone can feel in coexistence and peace together, although history is a little bit more complicated and perhaps not as pink and fluffy as sometimes it's presented in such tours.
I want to, if there are more questions you can ask Asaf. I just want to quickly follow up on Jim's comment because Asaf can't say this, but if you go to TripAdvisor, leave as many stars as possible. So if they're 5, leave 5, whatever it is. Asaf deserves it. Every tour is just so incredible and so much hard work goes into this. So I want to say thank you on behalf of everybody. I don't mean to shut it down because I know there are people who need to go to services and things like that. I want to say, Asaf, first of all, I cannot wait for you to lead an in-person CTJ tour. And maybe we have to bring some of our MBCC friends with us because I haven't been to these sites. I've been to Mount Zion, but I haven't gone to these sites because you're right. You're always rushing to all the other sites that are on a usual tour. So thank you so much for incredible information. And it's interesting, on Shavuot, on our last major Jewish holiday, I did a teaching of how Judaism shifted from Mount Sinai being a focus to Mount Zion being a focus. And maybe what you're telling me is I need to add a third category to that now that Mount Zion is not a focus anymore. So I'm going to have to update my teaching. It was terrific as always. Thank you so much for all your time.
Thank you.
Any last questions? One more. Anybody? This is your chance. All right, you're getting thank yous. So go to TripAdvisor, help Asaf keep doing what he's doing because he's the best. We are so grateful. And to our friends at MBCC, thank you for joining us. We look forward to continuing the conversation, learning more in the coming months. And we're already talking with Asaf about the next thing he's going to do for us. And so if you'd like to join us, we'll make sure you have the information as well. Asaf, thank you. Stay well.
Thank you, friends.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very good.
Have a great day, everybody. Thank you so much. Stay well.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Yeah.